This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay. Alice Packard was a 57-year-old Suffolk tenant farmer's wife when the Great War began in August 1914. She lived with Horace, her husband, and 4 of her 6 adult children at Overhaul in Shotley. Shotley is a rather scattered but picturesque village at the termination of the peninsula formed by the estuaries of the Orwell and the Stour opposite Harwich. There it is. This is a slightly later map than the First World War, but it does for the purposes of illustrating where it is. The war struck inescapably at Alice's family and community, although the contents of her wartime diaries provide a timely reminder to avoid entrenched stereotypes and to appreciate the conflict's kaleidoscopic qualities. Alice's experiences also demonstrate how her domestic sphere directly intersected with the world of the armed forces, not least because Shotley, located between the coastal towns of Felixstowe and Harwich, was part of an important base for naval operations, including aviation. In his post-war memoir, the flying boat pilot T.D. Hallam described the Harwich Harbour area as the centre of intense anti-Hun activity. Yet even as Alice's locality became militarised, everyday civilian life continued, a point which is often forgotten amid the public's appetite for heroic narratives. Susan Grayzell reminds us that women formed the largest group of adult non-combatants during the Great War. Yet the popular imagination has tended to focus on photogenic, younger and unmarried women who were and remain a significant part of both World Wars' visual iconography. Alice did not manufacture munitions. She was not a land girl. It's unlikely she waved a white feather, and she was not a suffragette. She did keep a pocket diary for most of her life. Surviving copies range from 1873 until her death in 1934, with some of her 19th century diaries missing. Each day's entry was spatially restricted to a few lines, which Alice, even during the war, primarily used this space to record the daily weather conditions, farmhouse administration, agricultural tasks, domestic chores, journeys, maladies and social calls that had occupied her and her middle-class farming family, with little elaboration or reflection. Her matter-of-fact tone rarely suggested explicit anxiety, or for that matter patriotism, albeit she noted King George V's 2 wartime visits to Shotley in March 1915 and February 1918. On the latter occasion she wrote, "The girls and I went to see him arrive." Alice's writing clearly demonstrates what Peter Liddell has called the extraordinary normalcy of wartime life, albeit through a series of scribbled hints rather than a complete picture. Now, historians exploring the emotional impacts of the Great War have sought to decode the oblique clues within such personal writings, and in so doing they've eroded the traditional division of masculine frontline and feminine home front. As Grayzell has demonstrated, the boundaries between the two fronts were often porous. This permeability forms part of a rich seam in contemporary Great War historiography, involving an emphasis on the extreme variety of experience, a broader definition of the home front, including untold stories and ordinary women, and explorations into how the conflict affected local and regional identities in Britain. And these approaches are invaluable in seeking to locate the significance of Alice Packard's wartime writing. And in this paper this evening, I hope to outline some examples of how Alice framed the war against her everyday life at home, even as it disrupted her family farm and village. And I'll also seek to demonstrate how her staunchly local concerns provide a unique glimpse into civil-military relations in a small rural community. So Alice and Horace married in 1881. They moved to Shotley in 1889. Horace assumed the tenancy of Overhaul Farm in 1894. By the outbreak of war in August 1914, Alice's daughters, Ethel, then aged 32, Marion, aged 29, and her 2 younger sons, Arthur, 23, and Reginald, 22, still lived at home. Her elder son, Stanley, aged 30, farmed at Yaxley, a village to the west of Eye, in the north of Suffolk, while her next eldest son, Frank, 27, farmed at Capel St Mary to the southwest of Ipswich. He married in September 1914, the first of her children to do so. During the war, Stanley and Arthur served in the army, while Frank and Reginald remained as farmers. This reflects the wider pattern. Half the men of military age in England and Wales were neither enlisted or conscripted and remained as civilians during the First World War. What of their village? Well, Shotley's population had increased from 750 people in 1901 to 2,243 people in 1911, following the construction in 1905 of an onshore Royal Naval training establishment for boys to supplement the offshore HMS Ganges training ship. The new Shotley barracks included a naval hospital. From 1913, Captain George Cayley commanded the establishment, residing with Mildred, his wife, at Overton Hall, a Tudor mansion about 2 miles from the barracks. Shotley's pre-war rural and naval communities were not isolated from each other. For instance, Captain Cayley and some sailors came to the rescue when militant suffragette arsonists targeted a nearby farm in May 1914. Less dramatically, Alice wrote on 27th of June, "Lovely day, jumble sale held at Overton Hall, and garden fete, tennis tournament, etc. by Captain and Mrs. Cayley, in aid of the new reading room furnishing fund. We all went and took the servants. I won nice cake sent by Lieutenant Eyre." Prior to the war, the villagers would have also become used to the appearance of visiting naval craft. Cruisers, destroyers, submarines, torpedo boats moored off Harwich. Guns at Landguard Fort in Felixstowe, on that kind of small peninsula to the right there. Guns at Landguard Fort in Felixstowe and Beacon Hill in Harwich, just beneath where it says Harwich Harbour, protected the harbour's entrance. Nestled between these armed promontories, the Shotley training establishment also possessed a heavy gun battery, and you can see the boys up there training with 6-inch guns at Shotley Barracks in 1916. Felixstowe also played a growing role in aviation, with an air station near Landguard commissioned in August 1913. It's not there anymore. The port of Felixstowe has swallowed up where the air station was. But clearly, facing the Low Countries across a relatively narrow stretch of the North Sea, this area had a clear and historic strategic significance. The outbreak of war intruded suddenly upon Alice's diary, although this is unsurprising, given she rarely commented on national, let alone international affairs. The start of August 1914 found the Packards preoccupied with the final stages of harvest. On 3rd of August, the weather at Shotley was fair, with a few drops of rain. The last of the wheat was cut. The evening entertainment comprised rabbit catching, followed by supper and a game of bridge. The following day, Alice recorded a trip to Ipswich with Horace and wrote, "Fair, war imminent, Germany, Russia, other powers." And on 5th of August, terrible war declared between Germany. And left it at that. She attended church twice on Sunday, the 9th of August. We had special service in evening on account of the war raging, and all of us went. But after this, Alice only made sketchy observations in her diary as to the military progress of the war. On 28th of August, she recorded dreadful fighting going on abroad, and on 3rd of October remarked the terrible Battle of the Aisne still raging in France, Allies versus Germans. Later, she wrote 2 young relatives, including her nephew, were killed in 1916 and 1917 respectively, and she noted the death of her solicitor's son in France by stray shell. But on the whole, the Continental War remained remote in her diaries, as did its casualties. In August 1914, the reality and human impact of another aspect of the war was almost immediately driven home to the people of Shotley and to Alice, reflecting the villagers' position near the naval front line. Harwich was the war station for various light cruisers, destroyers and submarines, including Commodore Reginald Tyrwhitt's flotillas, which later gained national fame as the Harwich Striking Force. At 6:30 a.m. on 5th of August, Tyrwhitt's flotillas left harbour to commence hostilities. Alice recorded, "Our ships went out for first sea fight." The light cruiser HMS Amphion sank the mine layer SS Königin Louise, but subsequently struck one of the latter's mines, losing about half of its 320 men, along with several rescued German prisoners. Alice noted on 6th of August, "We went down to see the wounded brought into barracks." So she was confronted with injury and death at an unusually early stage of the war, and she centred the conflict on her locality, writing on the 8th of August, "8 first victims of the war buried in our Shotley churchyard, 4 Germans in 2 graves and 4 English in separate graves." And they're still there. Further casualties necessitated an expansion of Shotley's churchyard in October 1914, and Alice mentioned another naval funeral at Shotley Church in September 1916 for 32 victims of an accidental submarine collision off the coast of Harwich. But again, as with the Continental War, the naval war is surprisingly absent from her diaries. Was her virtual silence on the wider war a form of self-censorship? Did she find the war too terrible or dreadful to write about? In any case, she simply continued her convention of plainly noting what she and her family experienced from day to day, with her reportage becoming fuzzier with distance from Overhaul and Shotley. This is clearly demonstrated in her writing about her son Arthur. Arthur, her son, joined the Army Service Corps in February 1915. The Packards had a car, and Arthur, before the war, is noted to be motoring around in it quite a lot, so it's a natural career progression for him. So Arthur joins the Army Service Corps in February 1915. Unlike his brother Stanley, Stanley enlists in the Suffolk Regiment in November 1914 and lost his left foot to shrapnel after just 1 week on the Western Front the following spring. Arthur served uninjured until the end of the war. Now, Alice maintains a cash account of Arthur's army pay and his expenditure in the back of her 1916 diary, quite meticulous cash account. But her writing gives no sense, beyond the phrase driver, motor, of what he actually did during the war. And she did not preserve or note any correspondence beyond a record of parcels, usually food from the farm, and money that she sent to him in France. This is not to imply she did not often think about her absent son or write to him, but rather that his distance from the immediate and the local meant a drastically reduced presence in her diaries. On the few occasions when Arthur returned on leave, Alice did not dwell on his soldier identity. Beyond a few references to purely administrative duties, such as him coming to London to kind of gain extensions for his leave, or Arthur had to go over to Harwich to report himself. So her references to his soldier identity are purely administrative. She focused on his temporary re-engagement with the family. For example, on his first leave in January 1916, he went shooting on the farm with his father and his uncle. They got quite a nice little bag. A subsequent leave period ended on the 23rd of December 1917. He comes home on the 10th of December 1917. He has to leave on the 23rd. So the family adjusts their festive routine. Alice noting on 22nd of December 1917, "We kept evening as Christmas Day for Arthur's sake, had turkey dinner in evening, bridge after." And so she tends to place the returning soldier within a safe, local, home-centred context. Her account of Stanley's wounding reflected similar concerns. There's very little detail as to how he lost his foot, and there's a lot more focus on his recovery at home. On 30th of May 1915, Stanley was wounded at the start of May 1915. On the 30th of May, he comes back to Britain. He goes to Lincoln Hospital. He's at Lincoln for a few months, and in September, he arrives at Overhaul for a difficult period of convalescence under his mother's watchful eye. And Alice being Alice, it's not particularly reflective how she describes his recovery at Shotley, but rather there are kind of subtle hints as to the kind of difficult period of rehabilitation that both she and her son endure. For example, on 23rd of October, she writes, "Dr. Carey in to see Stan's leg. She crosses out leg and replaces it with stump." Now, it's simple thing, but perhaps hints at her struggle to come to terms with her son's dismemberment. More positively for Stanley, he returns to his own farm at Yaxley in March 1916, and he receives a hero's welcome from the local children and his men. in July, he marries Margaret Taylor, who is a nurse who he met while recovering at Lincoln. So his wounding facilitated a courtship. They marry in July 1916, and they spend much of their honeymoon at Shotley, where a nice lot of presents awaited them, as well as a boat trip around the harbour, courtesy of Commodore Cayley. The couple held their at-home day at Yaxley in August, which Alice called a very jolly day. And you see this in the diaries quite a lot, where episodes of happiness and familial normality continue and coexist even alongside the traumatic impact of the war. Adrian Gregory has identified a peculiar dilemma in British society as it transitioned from peace to war. The call for business as usual, and therefore leisure as usual, increasingly conflicted with the demand for the public to volunteer their services for the war effort. Yet, as de Groot has suggested, the British still managed occasionally to enjoy themselves. Alice certainly writes about leisure and recreation, and this often has quite a local focus. If I go back to this picture of Overhaul, you will see it has a large fish pond in front of it. So quite a large fish pond. In early 1917, during a particularly cold winter, it freezes over, and Alice notes on 28th of January that Marion and Reg skating on pond when not at work. On subsequent evening, others, including officers from the barracks, join them until the thaw begins on 10th of February. But in this brief period of time, it's almost quite a magical episode in Alice's wartime diaries. She provides succinct but evocative descriptions of skating by moonlight and of young people out on the ice. In warmer weather, the farm's woods provided an idyllic retreat. Alice writing on 4th of May 1917, lovely day. All the girls picnicking in the wood for tea and enjoyed it much. She went with them a couple of days later and said the wood was lovely with flowers. It's quite idyllic episodes. But of course it was impossible to ignore the war, and the diaries indicate various ways in which Alice's family and community respond beyond military service. The experiences of her daughters appear to fit into typical narratives of women's war work. Ethel gained nursing experience through the voluntary aid detachments. From November 1914, she worked at Henham Hall, now more famous as the location for the Latitude Festival. She worked at Henham Hall from November 1914 near Southwold. Later she went to Ampton Hall near Bury St Edmunds. And finally she ends up in St Thomas's Hospital in London, where she returns after the war to St Thomas's, where she trains as a professional nurse. Marion, however, remained in Shotley. The younger daughter, she remained in Shotley, and from August 1914 takes an interest in Red Cross work, local Red Cross work, and other voluntary work such as cutting out clothes for soldiers, making bandages, things like that, fairly typical. Yet both Ethel and Marion's stories, while they appear to be typical on the surface, they also demonstrate that public national duty was often intertwined with or superseded by private family obligations. So Ethel, in between working as a nurse, looking after wounded soldiers, she spent some of 1916 at Yaxley, presumably helping with Stanley's recover, a more private form of kind of looking after a wounded soldier. In August 1918, she interrupted her training at St Thomas's to move to Capel, at her brother Frank's request, as his wife was in ill health following a miscarriage. So again, kind of going away from the kind of public duty towards the more pressing family obligation. In Marion's case, her initial kind of vigour for Red Cross work and voluntary work seems to have been tempered from around the spring of 1916, when her time was occupied with domestic chores and farm work far more, probably and most likely as a result of the introduction of conscription and its impact on the farm's male agricultural labour force. Now, as I've kind of alluded to, local voluntary efforts focused during the First World War on providing comfort and relief for soldiers and sailors, especially for casualties and prisoners. And Alice recorded various local Red Cross meetings and sales. The Cayleys at Overton Hall also organised fundraisers. Alice often donated to fundraising efforts, usually again food from the farm, particularly from the dairy. The reading room in the village hosted charity concerts, sometimes by Shotley's Shotley-based services personnel, and the reading room hosted other entertainments such as a charity whist drive, which raised £8 in February 1915. On a larger scale in the final 2 years of the war, Alice further demonstrated her commitment to the war effort by investing several £100s into the war loan, and this represented some of the inheritance she'd gained following her mother's death in December 1916, with Alice perhaps also inspired by a village meeting on potato growing and war loan held in early 1917. So you do get this sense of this very kind of local, usually middle class orientated village response to the war, to be seen to be doing something, from the kind of quite minor to the major to kind of larger scale efforts. I'll just say a little bit about the farm during the war. In the 1930s, a contemporary farmer reflected that it was impossible to lose money during the Great War if you were a farmer, and the Packards certainly do not appear to have suffered economic hardship, even if Alice grumbled in June 1918 of income tax being raised exorbitantly. Her complaint nonetheless reflects how military priorities and the state authorities became increasingly intrusive as the war ground on. In June 1915, for example, Reginald had to attend, her youngest son had to attend a meeting in Ipswich about our stover being commandeered by government for the army horses on continent. Alice did not record the outcome, although later in the month some soldiers came voluntarily and helped with stover stacking. Wonder if that is them coming to take away their fodder. The Military Service Act of January 1916 introduced conscription for single men between 18 and 41, and this has an impact on the farm's labour force. It makes Reginald, Alice's youngest son's position as a civilian non-combatant, more precarious. And Alice makes occasional allusions to Horace going to the local tribunal at Ipswich to apply for exemptions and to appeal its decisions. For example, Reginald gains a conditional exemption in June 1916, which lasts to the end of the war, along with the shepherd and another farm labourer. But Alice often writes about Reg having to go to either Ipswich or Bury St Edmunds for a checkup to have his fitness assessed, and so the kind of threat of the risk of conscription lingers in the background, especially in 1917 when the Military Service Act is further widened. Female wartime labour overhaul was largely a family affair. The Women's Land Army don't play a significant role for the Packards. Female wartime labour was mainly a family affair. It mainly occurred in the dairy and on occasion out in the field. Marion and Bertha Seaman, who was Alice's niece, began milking duties in March 1916, again reflecting this kind of point in the war in early 1916 when the state begins to intrude far more. Bertha, who normally lived in Ipswich, stayed at Shotley until August 1917. On Boxing Day 1916, Marion gave all the milkers a tea, she and Bertha with them. And perhaps this demonstrated a sense of dairy solidarity, but it also indicates how Marion and Bertha, despite undertaking similar work, nonetheless remained apart from the milkers. Patience Hervey, the rector's daughter, and the Hervey family, she was related, her father was John Frederick Arthur Hervey, who was the rector of Shotley, the son of the Bishop of Bath and Wells, related to the Marquis of Bristol, who was the major landowner in Shotley and owned Overhaul Farm. And it's an interesting relationship the Packards have with the Herveys in Shotley, because of course they are related to the landowners. But Patience Hervey, the rector's daughter, also helped with milking at various points in 1917 and 1918, obtaining new boots and gaiters for farm work, and even helping with rabbiting and ratting. And Alice's diaries really hint at the novelty of the girls working on the farm, and she suggests, or at least hints at, how this challenged assumptions about appropriate gender and most likely class roles, given that these young women become a subject for curious spectators. In March 1917, Patience's sister, returning from London, came to see the girls work. One of Horace's business associates visits the next week with his wife. They also go, as well as looking around the farm, they go to look at the girls milking, and Alice makes a specific point of noting this. In April, a photographer from Ipswich came to capture one of Horace's Suffolk Punch stallions. But he also kind of took Alice also notes that he took a picture of the girls, Bertha, Marion and Patience, in their working attire. So they make a point of getting a picture of them all together in their working attire. Sadly, the image of the young ladies is missing, but the photograph of the horse survives. There he is. That's Subborn Bow Chief, who is a magnificent specimen, cost 650 guineas. So Horace certainly wasn't doing too badly during the war, and Alice records him spending a colossal amount of money on Suffolk Punch horses. He'd been a breeder of Shire horses prior to this, but he gets into Suffolk Punchers during the war. One of the great Suffolk Punch studs is broken up in Suffolk, I think in 1917, and Horace goes along to the auction and brings back all these magnificent horses. Anyway. So that's just a little bit about the farm in a sense, and kind of in some ways how it reflects the national picture, but also kind of a very local dimension as well. I'd like to move on now to German aerial bombing raids. German aerial bombing raids periodically and dramatically brought the violence of the war home, especially if you lived in the eastern regions. Of 51 airship raids launched against England, over half involved bombs falling on East Anglia. The first attack, in fact the first Zeppelin attack, occurs on 19th of January 1915. That involves bombs over Great Yarmouth and King's Lynn in Norfolk. Alice provides a series of eyewitness and second-hand accounts, and I think they provide insights into how civilians in the eastern regions frame the war. Her writing also reflects the critique of The Times, whose editorial on the 3rd of April 1916 chastised that the public are always in danger of losing their sense of proportion in the matter of these air raids, displaying a more profound interest in the last two Zeppelin attacks than in the whole mighty struggle before Verdun. And this really reflects how Alice writes. As I said, she barely mentions the Continental War. But she writes a lot about Zeppelins. She mentions Zeppelins. She uses Zeppelin as a synonym for airships in 14 separate entries between 15th of April 1915 and 19th of October 1917. Her initial report was a second-hand one. It referred to an attack on Henham with no damage caused by the bomb. And I think she mentioned this because it had a family connection. On that day, Ethel had travelled up there with Reginald to fetch her luggage back after a spell of nursing there. As I said, she'd been a nurse at Henham Hall initially. And so she goes up there on, coincidentally, the same day a Zeppelin attack occurs over Southwold. So Alice mentions it, there's a family connection. On 12th of August 1915, the Packards experienced an attack firsthand. German Zeppelin dropped bomb on our marsh at night. A tremendous din of guns and explosions. Very exciting. The next day a crowd gathers on the marsh to see the aftermath. I presume there's just a big hole and they all peer into it. The villagers go down and have a look. And the diaries provide a real sense of this fascination, both communal and personal, inspired by what must have been quite ethereal visitors. On 25th of April 1916, Alice wrote of a Zeppelin visit at night. Saw a great sight from my window, firing at it by searchlight. And this is the same night that the German Navy are shelling Great Yarmouth and Lowestoft, which doesn't mention that, even though that's just up the coast. Similarly, when the marsh gets bombed, that's the same night Woodbridge, for example, suffers several casualties, and a whole street of houses is damaged in Woodbridge. But she mentions what she sees, and if you've ever been to Suffolk and you've spent any time there, you'll know that the Suffolk sky is very big. It's a very big sky. It's hard to explain, but certainly I lived in the house where Alice lived in for a few months, and if you look out of those upper windows, you have an amazing view. So she would have got this panoramic, almost kind of cinemascope vision of the Zeppelins kind of coming over from out of the sea and over Suffolk, and kind of watching them in the searchlights. So I can kind of see where she's coming from with this. Sometimes a curious familiarity blended with apprehension, such as on the 24th of August 1916. The Zeps came again at night. Our new Shotley gun got to work. The girls and I got into the cellar for a few minutes. The firing of ground-based guns formed part of the sensory experience of raids, while Alice's communal reference to our Shotley gun is telling. Summer 1916 provided good opportunities for airship spotting on the Suffolk coast, although this carried certain risks. In September, Alice reported that the girls had taken Hilda Palmer, a villager, some lemon pearl barley on account of her rheumatic fever from cold watching Zeps. The downing of a Zeppelin presented an irresistible spectacle, especially for car owners like the Packards. In late September 1916, Alice wrote, "Reg motored Marion, Bertha and me through Colchester to Wigborough to see the Zeppelin brought down last Saturday night." There's another photo, another angle where you can see a crowd of people standing kind of, the police have set up a barrier, and this crowd of people, I wonder, is Alice in that crowd? But thousands of people would go to where these Zeppelins came down. Real spectator sport. Enterprising farmers would charge people to park in their fields and things like this. More dramatically, like thousands of others throughout the county, in the early hours of 17th of June 1917, the Packards saw the L-48. You can see the painting back there. The L-48 brought down in flames. Alice wrote, she saw the L-48 brought down in flames, and the final journey of this Zeppelin, as I've crudely drawn on there, takes it, it comes over the sea over Hollesley, skirts around, drops bombs here on Curtin. You can easily see across here from Shotley, so Alice would have seen it dropping bombs over Curtin, but she wouldn't have seen it end up over here, which is where it finally crashes near Leiston. But she would have seen it in its final journey, and thousands of people see this in Suffolk and go to see. I don't think she goes to see the crash site for this one though. I was struck by how benign Alice's writing is in reference to the Zeppelin visits. So there's little sense of the outrage or the demonising rhetoric of baby killers, which are usually associated with Zeppelin raids. She did not mention civilian deaths, except for one indirect local casualty in October 1917. Mr. Crawford died suddenly at Red House Farm from heart trouble late in evening during air raid. And that's the only Zeppelin casualty she mentions, and it's only indirect. He's the chap whose farm, Red House Farm, was attacked by the suffragettes earlier on, before the First World War. So poor old Mr. Crawford, he survives the militant suffragettes, but the Zeppelins do for him. Alice was more critical, much more critical of German bomber aircraft. Distinction, when the Zeppelins start to kind of be replaced in late summer 1917 by bomber aircraft, she's far more critical. The German bombers launch half the raids but cause far greater casualties than Zeppelins. And I think here is where Alice does chime in with the national picture slightly. She mentions on 13th of June, second hand, a notorious daylight raid. German bombers came over East London, Poplar, and they killed, and she writes, German bombers came over East London and killed and injured many people and children. And I think this is Alice is angered by this and records this and is far more critical of bombers in general. I think the Poplar raid is quite a crucial point in the war, really, of kind of in terms of the public's kind of awareness of German atrocities. In any case, Alice soon stops thinking about London and returns to her own locality, her own farm, because Overhaul Farm itself suffers an air attack by German bombers on 4th of July 1917. German Gotha bombers fly over the Harwich Harbour and they drop bombs. And this map here is in the National Archives. You can see that it's covered in dots. It hasn't come out very clearly here, but it's covered in dots where the bombs fell. But the ones we're interested in, these two red dots here, you can see Overhaul, you can see the fish pond out the front there, above where it says Netherhall, and you can see two bombs there. Alice wrote on 4th of July 1917, "Lovely weather. At 7:15 a.m. we were bombed by German aircraft. Windows smashed in house and dairy, cow buyer very much injured, fowl runs demolished, and other buildings, etc., damaged." And this raid causes widespread it causes destruction around Felixstowe and Harwich. People are killed, but again, this kind of very, this is what happened to us. And a few weeks later, there's another morning raid, and she noted this time, no bombs fell on us this time. So kind of recording the raid and recording very much how it affects her, how it affects her family. Perhaps most unforgivably, an air raid interrupted a social call in October 1917. She writes, in the evening, Lieutenant Grant, who was a gun officer, an anti-aircraft gun officer, came to pheasant supper. Lieutenant Grant came to pheasant supper, and for a game of bridge. They're always playing bridge. It's they're either drinking tea or playing bridge. So Lieutenant Grant came for a pheasant supper and for a game of bridge. But he was sent for before the card game started to go to the gun, German aircraft being about. And notably here, the raid occurs in the evening, the Germans no longer risking daylight sorties. So I often think about Alice's accounts of these air raids and what they represent. And I mean, obviously these air raids demonstrate a new vulnerability for the British Isles. They demonstrate the erasure of the line between civilian and combatant in the kind of nascent era of total war. But eyewitness accounts like Alice's do give a sense of a more complex fascination with these new technologies and their multifaceted impact on the local as well as the national. Interestingly, and perhaps owing to self-censorship, Alice barely mentions British aviation, even though she lives over the river from Felixstowe Air Station, which was undertaking a huge amount of activity in this sphere, including seaplanes and what have you. So she barely mentions that. Just across the River Orwell, there would have been British planes, a lot of activity, but she doesn't write about it. The strategic importance of the Harwich Harbour area not only made it a target for air raids, regardless of what Alice writes, it's not the farm they're after, it's the ships in the harbour, it's Felixstowe Seaplane Base, it's the Shotley Barracks. The strategic importance of the Harwich Harbour area not only made it a target for air raids, but it also meant an intensification of military control during the war and an increased number of uniformed men in Shotley. And this impacted on everyday life in the village in various ways. For instance, the occasional presence of soldiers and sailors helping on the farm. That was a positive impact. Now, Alice's writing about the appearance of these services personnel in Shotley is typically patchy. She rarely describes their rank or role. She never offers an opinion on people's character. Very rarely kind of writes about people in a kind of personality sense. But she does record encounters with them. And these demonstrate how the domestic sphere also intruded on military life. This wasn't simply the military coming into Shotley and taking over. The domestic also interfered in their world too. And in particular, Alice keeps, for her, relatively detailed accounts of her family's interactions with two officers, Lieutenants Fryer and Hole, in the second half of the war. Lieutenant William Samuel Fryer came to Shotley because of regulatory developments connected to national security. In May 1916, Regulation 29B, issued under the Defence of the Realm Consolidation Act, provided that the military authorities could declare special military areas within the United Kingdom to improve security for sensitive locations. Declared in September 1916, the Harwich Special Military Area covered parts of Felixstowe, Harwich and Shotley, including most of Overhaul Farm. 24th of September, the Packards went to the reading room for permit books and photo taking. 3 days later, the special area came into effect. It's behind that red line, essentially, the part that covers Shotley. The Overhaul Farm is most of the land that's behind the line. Alice observed lots of soldiers guarding, all have to have passes. This caused some minor inconveniences. Ethel attempted to return home in October after a stay at Capel, but had not received her permit book, so couldn't. In May 1917, a visitor to the farm had no permit, so the Packards picnicked with him in the woods instead, which you can see just outside the military area. Other than these two minor inconveniences, Alice doesn't offer any comment on the fact that her village has a barrier running across it. Nothing at all, no criticism. Lieutenant Fryer was the initial officer in charge of the village barrier guards. He calls for tea at Overhaul on 4th of October 1916. So he's been there a week or so. He calls for tea. He was in his late 30s, came from Norfolk, where he was married with children, and he was an estate agent in civilian life. I know this from his military record. Alice doesn't tell us anything about him, really. Given his age, given his home defence duties, it's likely he was medically exempted from overseas service. Horace brought him home for tea again on Sunday the 8th of October. Freuler had just read the lessons at the church and embedded himself in village life. Freuler stayed for supper, followed by hymns, etc. in the evening. 2 days later, Freuler returned for a supper of hot partridges, followed by music. And likely impressed by all of this hospitality, he arranged a billet at Overhaul and moved in on the 26th of October. It seems to be that's where all the good food was. So she writes very little about his official duties, which is a shame, because I'd love to know really who these barrier guards were and what they did. But all she writes about is, he reads at the church every now and again. He goes for tea at the rectory with her daughters. So we get a sense of this kind of social aspect, domestic aspect of this military man's life in Shotley. But such relationships were fundamentally precarious. On 28th of November, a telegram arrived, summoning Freuler and his men away, quite unexpectedly. He returned a few days later to pay for the men's billets and have another lunch at Overhaul. Alice doesn't record any emotion or thoughts at his departure, but did note the receipt of 10 shillings as payment for his billet in her 1917 diary. I think more tellingly, Horace sends a retriever dog to Freuler's Norfolk home in January. So this indicates there was a friendship there. There was some reason that they got on and were close. Moving on, like Freuler, Lieutenant Harold Percy Hull was in his late 30s as well. These men are not too far off Alice's own son's age, which I think might have played a role in kind of their relationship with these men. Harold Percy Hull was in his late 30s and married. He served in the Royal Garrison Artillery. He was anti-aircraft home defence, so he was one of these gun officers. He came from Hull, where he worked as a tailor. He suffered from an intestinal abnormality. Again, that's his military record. Alice doesn't write this down. And this kept him away from overseas duty. Although what also seems to have kept him away from overseas duties, if you look at his military record, he keeps avoiding going for medical checkups later in the war. And then where is he? Where is Hull? Probably having tea with the Packards. He first appeared in Alice's diary on 22nd of March 1918 when he came to tea with his wife, Ethel. The couple, so Lieutenant Hull and his wife, and his 4 children, lived in a cottage at Shotley, maintaining their family unit, at least temporarily, in spite of the war. As with Freuler, Alice's writing almost completely demilitarised her family's relationship with the Hulls, focusing on the domestic and social rather than the military reasons that had brought them to Shotley. Social interactions between the families generally occurred at least once a week between April and August, including the ubiquitous ritual of tea, as well as games of bridge, various meals and evenings spent listening to gramophone music and singing hymns. So a bit like Freuler. The Hulls brought other officers into the Packard social circle, but whenever they appear, Alice's diary concentrates on the trivial and mundane. For instance, when Lieutenants Dennis and Mansell came to tea at Overhaul on 7th of July, she only recorded that the latter let his cigarette case fall into the garden pond. Very trivial. Hull moves across the River Stour to Dovercourt, near Harwich, in August 1918. His family also left Shotley. On occasion, he's still called at Overhaul, usually for tea and sometimes bringing others. Ethel Hull reappears on the 9th of November, turned up for tea with her husband, goes for a farm walk with Marion. After the armistice, the Hulls still call at Overhaul Farm a few more times. So she gives this kind of quite detailed account of the relationship in terms of when they saw each other, not so much of what they did.